The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the pediatric supply closet at Mercy General, and Elena Martinez had already reorganized the third shelf twice. 5:47 in the morning. 13 minutes before her shift officially began. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd once placed tourniquets in the dark, her fingers positioning for kits for one-handed retrieval, sorting 18-gauge angiocath needles into ascending order by gauge size. The antiseptic smell was sharp in her nostrils, bleach and something chemical that reminded her of field hospitals in Tikrit, except here the floor was clean and nobody was bleeding out on the concrete. She'd been working at Mercy General for exactly 3 weeks. 21 days. The hiring process had taken 12 minutes. HR had glanced at her sparse personnel file, travel nursing in rural clinics, they'd noted, satisfied, and never asked why her previous employment history ended in 2004. They never asked about the redacted sections or the gap that stretched like a scar across 2 decades. Elena had learned long ago that people saw what they expected to see, a tired woman in her 50s with dark circles under her eyes and competent hands. They didn't see the way her shoulders still carried the muscle memory of a plate carrier, or the silver chain hidden beneath her scrubs that held a single dog tag, or the pair of worn combat boots wrapped in a towel at the back of her locker, size 7 men's, caked with Iraqi dust that no amount of cleaning ever fully removed. The boots had belonged to a different person. She kept them anyway. Elena moved through the pediatric ward with the kind of careful invisibility that comes from learning how to occupy space without being seen. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. Morning shift wasn't scheduled to start for 12 more minutes, but she was already moving between rooms, already reading charts, already watching. Mercy General's pediatric unit was clean and efficient and, in her professional assessment, systematically failing one particular 8-year-old boy. His name was Marcus Brennan. His father was a Navy SEAL, currently deployed in an undisclosed location that Elena didn't need to know because she made a point of not knowing things anymore. His grandmother sat vigil in a plastic chair beside his bed, fingers working a rosary, her eyes red-rimmed and ancient. Marcus was deaf. The hearing aids in his ears were state-of-the-art military issue, expensive, precise, but he rarely wore them. He preferred silence. Elena understood the preference. She'd been reviewing his chart for 2 days now. 5 different specialists had examined the boy for recurring chest pain and shortness of breath. 5 doctors, each one running new tests, each one billing Tricare, a military health insurance, for the privilege of their expertise. The cardiologist had ordered a chest X-ray and EKG. The pulmonologist had ordered a CT scan. The pediatrician had ordered a metabolic panel. The rheumatologist had ordered an HLA-B27 test. None of them had found anything. None of them had listened to the pattern of the billing codes. Elena had. The discrepancies lived in the numbers. Procedures marked as performed that she'd never witnessed. Consultation fees for specialists who'd never entered the room. $9,200 for an echocardiogram that had taken the sonographer for minutes to complete. $12,000 for a cardiology consultation that lasted less time than it took to read a chart. The numbers added up to almost $47,000 in 3 weeks, all of it flowing into Mercy General's administrative accounts, all of it routed through a billing department that reported directly to Dr. Benjamin Sterling, Mercy General's chief of pediatrics. Elena transcribed the irregularities into her personal notebook, dates, times, procedure codes, insurance claim numbers. She used a pen with a fine tip and handwriting so small it required reading glasses. She'd learned organization from the military, document everything, trust nothing, keep records that could fit inside a locker. The notebook was now in her locker, wrapped inside the towel with the combat boots, sitting beside the only photograph she still kept, a picture of her daughter at 12 years old, taken 4 years ago, before everything changed. She was still writing when Dr. Benjamin Sterling entered the pediatric ward at 5:58 a.m., exactly 2 minutes before shift change. His white coat was pressed. His shoes were Italian leather, buffed to a shine that caught the fluorescent light. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by any institution that mattered. His father was a federal judge, his mother's family owned significant real estate in the Heights, and his network of colleagues extended through every hospital board in Harris County. He was flanked by 2 residents who laughed at his jokes with the practiced enthusiasm of people whose careers depended on his recommendation. One of them held his coffee. The other carried his tablet. Dr. Sterling looked at Elena the way surgeons look at medical waste. The new nurse, he said, not to her but to the space around her, the way people speak about objects that can't hear them. Still settling in. Elena closed her notebook. She kept her voice level, pitched low enough that only he could hear it. "Good morning, Doctor." "That's not an answer to my question." She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked away. The textbook response. The expected response. A new employee showing proper deference to institutional hierarchy. 3 weeks tomorrow. Still learning the protocols here. Protocols. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who understood that the system was designed to protect people like him. Mercy General has very specific protocols for billing and documentation. I trust you're familiar with them. I'm still reviewing them. Good. He turned away, ready to dismiss her from his attention entirely, when she spoke again. "Doctor, I had a question about Marcus Brennan's chart." The smile didn't change, but something in Dr. Sterling's shoulders shifted. A predator recognizing the movement of prey. "Yes?" "His billing codes. There's a pattern I wanted clarification on. The echocardiogram on March 12th, the chart shows a full study, but the sonographer was in the room for approximately 4 minutes total. The report indicates normal findings, no pathology, yet the claim was submitted at the maximum complexity level." Silence. The kind of silence that settles into hospital corridors at shift change, when the day nurses are arriving and the night nurses are leaving, when the building takes a single collective breath. Elena could hear the ventilator in the room beside them, the steady wheeze of a child's lungs being assisted by machine. She could hear the monitor beeping its mechanical rhythm, each beep a pulse, each pulse a life being tracked and measured and billed. Dr. Sterling's voice, when he spoke, was quiet. "That's a question for billing and compliance. I tried contacting them. They referred me back to the treating physician." "Then you have your answer, don't you?" He turned to face her directly now, and his eyes held the specific intensity of someone who understood that he'd just been threatened. "Not physically. Institutionally." Elena had just flagged irregularities that touched his domain, questioned the integrity of his department, implied, with precision and documentation, that something was wrong with the way his unit operated. Mercy General's protocols are established by administration. If you have concerns about billing practices, I suggest you schedule a meeting with the CFO. After you've worked here for more than 3 weeks. "Of course, Doctor." "Don't work too hard," he added, and the smile returned, sharper now. "We wouldn't want you burning out before you understand how things actually work here." He left then, his residents trailing behind him like remora fish following a shark. Elena stood in the hallway, her hand still holding the closed notebook, and allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of stillness. Then she returned to Marcus Brennan's room, to the grandmother with the rosary and the 8-year-old boy who preferred silence to the sound of the world failing him. His breathing was shallow. His color was pale. There were faint beads of perspiration across his forehead, and when Elena placed her hand on his chest to check his pulse, she felt the slight flutter of his heart, not quite an arrhythmia, but something close to it. Something irregular. Something that no doctor in this hospital had documented, because none of them had actually examined him carefully. They'd been too busy billing his father's insurance to notice that the child was fundamentally, significantly unwell. Elena pulled out the chart and began adding her own notes, documenting what she actually observed rather than what the protocols demanded she see. 12 hours of observation. 3 shifts. By the end of the day, she would have evidence. Not enough to prove anything. But enough to know. Not enough yet to act. Dr. Sterling gathered the morning huddle in the pediatric conference room at 8:22 a.m., 23 staff members crowded around the laminate table, fluorescent light casting everything in a sickly pale wash. He pointed at Elena standing in the back, her posture already the armor of someone used to being looked at. "Let's make this interesting," he announced, pulling out his wallet with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. He slapped a $100 bill on the table, crisp, new, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the silence. "I'm betting our new night shifter here doesn't last the week. Any takers?" Nervous laughter rippled through the room like a wave that reached Elena and broke against her without moving her face. She took one measured breath, watching him through steady eyes, her hands clasped behind her back in parade rest, a position she caught herself in and quickly adjusted. 18 years of muscle memory trying to surface in a Houston hospital. No one took the bet. They wouldn't. Sterling had been at Mercy General for 7 years and had cultivated allies the way other men cultivated roses, carefully, deliberately, with an eye toward what they owed him. 3 residents had already benefited from his recommendations to better departments. The nursing director's daughter had gotten a pediatrics rotation because Sterling made a call. Power was a network, and Elena was a stranger. At 11:42 a.m., Sterling found her in the cafeteria. Elena carried her tray past his table of resident physicians, turkey sandwich, sugar-free jello, black coffee, moving with a kind of economical grace that came from years of navigating tight spaces in field hospitals. Sterling extended his foot just enough. The tray crashed to the tile with a sound that made 3 patients at nearby tables flinch. Soup splattering across her scrubs, the broth spreading like a biological stain across the right hip of her whites. Every eye in the cafeteria turned. A few people had their phones out before the sound of breaking crockery finished echoing. Sterling rose slowly, his movements deliberate, savoring the moment like a predator who'd successfully cornered prey. He picked up Marcus Brennan's chart from his table and threw it at her feet, papers scattering across the spill like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Medical records fanning across the tile, vital signs, lab results, the echo report from 4 days ago that Sterling had signed off on personally. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. His voice had the smooth confidence of a man who'd never experienced consequences. "And while you're down there, maybe you can explain why you're questioning my billing decisions like you're some kind of fraud investigator instead of doing your actual job." Elena crouched, gathering the scattered papers with deliberate care. Each sheet wet with chicken broth and consomme. Her movements precise, methodical, not the movements of someone broken, but the movements of someone executing a task. And she felt it then, the hot pressure behind her eyes that she recognized as the prelude to the kind of crying she couldn't afford. 18 years since she'd let that happen in public. Not in Tikrit. Not in Seattle. Not now. One tear escaped anyway, cutting a track down her cheek as she rose, the chart reconstructed in her hands, papers organized in the same order they'd been scattered. She wiped the tear with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, the acoustic shift so subtle that only someone trained to hear tone changes would have noticed it. "I've cleaned up worse messes than yours, doctor," she said, and the cafeteria went silent in a way that made the fluorescent lights above seem impossibly loud. "Give me time." Sterling's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes, the moment a hunter realizes the animal it's cornered might have teeth. He sat back down without responding, which was worse than any words he could have chosen. Silence was territory. The residents at his table resumed eating, but their movements had lost their ease. Someone's phone camera had captured the moment. Elena knew it had. She could taste it in the air like copper before a storm. That afternoon, Sterling called her into his office at 2:34 p.m., and Marcus's grandmother was already sitting in the patient chair, a deliberate choice, using the family member as witness and leverage. Sterling explained in condescending tones that sometimes nurses with limited experience misunderstood the complexity of pediatric cardiology, and perhaps Elena should focus on basic care tasks rather than trying to play detective. His words had the texture of a threat wrapped in administrative guidance. He handed her a written warning for questioning physician judgment and creating family anxiety, a single sheet that required her signature. Elena read it 3 times to make sure she had it memorized, then signed it with handwriting so perfectly controlled it looked printed. "Is that all, doctor?" she asked, and her voice was the voice of someone who had long ago learned that saying too much was an invitation for retaliation. "For now," Sterling said, and smiled. That evening, Elena sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot for 47 minutes, watching the rain hammer the windshield in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The combat boot sat in her gym bag on the passenger seat, and she could smell the leather even through the canvas, a smell that meant something. Security. Identity. 17 years ago, those boots had walked through the streets of Tikrit, had run across rubble fields, had stopped while she pulled a 3-year-old boy out of a collapsed building with his father screaming in Arabic that the child was gone, the child was dead. She'd handed that boy to his father and never filed a report about it because the extraction had never happened officially. The boy had ceased to exist in any government record, and so had she. Now that boy was 8 years old and dying in a hospital bed for floors above her, and a man in a $2,000 suit was documenting her scope of practice concerns in hospital records that would follow her to every job she ever applied for. Sterling had started his documentation already. She'd seen the entry in the system, a chart note flagged with his name and timestamp at 2:19 p.m., noting concerns about the nursing staff expressing opinions on physician diagnostic decisions and the potential patient family manipulation through unwarranted clinical assessments. The language was the language of someone dismantling someone else's professional credibility, piece by piece, with the precision of a surgeon debulking a tumor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was competent at this, he'd done it before. 3 nurses in 5 years had been forced out of Mercy General after similar complaints. One had filed a complaint with the Texas Board of Nursing and had her license suspended pending investigation. One had moved to another hospital. One had stopped working in pediatrics altogether. Sterling had created a system where questioning him meant your career was the thing in question. He had allies. He had the hospital administration's ear because he generated revenue. His patients always seemed to need more imaging, more specialist consultations, more procedures that went into the billing system and came out as profit. The hospital CEO had taken Sterling to a golf tournament in Galveston 6 months ago. That was the kind of power that couldn't be challenged with documentation and observations. Elena started the engine and drove home through rain that fell like judgment, taking the long route through downtown Houston where the buildings were lit up against the darkness like promises that never quite came true. Her apartment was dark when she arrived, a studio on the east side of the city that cost $1,200 a month and smelled like other people's lives. She showered and changed into clothes that didn't smell like cafeteria broth and hospital fluorescent. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began pulling Marcus Brennan's complete medical record. For days. That's how long Sterling had been treating the boy. For days of outpatient visits for what he documented as anxiety and stress-related chest pain. For days of normal echocardiograms and normal chest x-rays and normal blood work. But somewhere in those normal results was a lie, not in the data, but in the interpretation. Medicine was pattern recognition, and Elena had spent 23 years learning to see patterns that killed people when you missed them. Sterling had missed something in Marcus, and the boy's body was beginning to pay the price. Elena opened the echo report from 2 days ago and looked at the images, the grayscale ballet of a functioning heart, chambers filling and emptying in their proper sequence. Normal. Completely normal. But she'd learned in Tikrit that normal could be the most dangerous thing in medicine, because it made you stop looking. The moment you declared something normal was the moment you stopped questioning it. She reached for the kitchen phone and called Mercy General. It took 40 seconds to get through to the pediatric floor. "This is Elena Martinez," she said. "Can you check on Marcus Brennan in room 412? I want to know his current oxygen saturation and respiratory rate." The nurse on the other end was Rebecca Torres, someone Elena had worked with on nights, and she didn't ask questions. Rebecca said she'd check and call back. 7 minutes later, Rebecca's voice came through the phone, and it had changed, sharpened, like a blade being honed. "His O2 sat is 94 on room air. His respiratory rate is 28. Elena, what are we looking for?" "His heart sounds," Elena said. "Can you listen?" Rebecca was back on the line in 90 seconds, and her voice was very quiet. Distant, she said. I don't know if that's normal. I don't know if I'm hearing it right. You are, Elena said. Keep monitoring him every 15 minutes. If his saturation drops below 92, if his breathing gets faster, if he looks scared, call me. Don't call Sterling. Call me. Elena, what's happening? Nothing yet, Elena said. But I need to be ready if it does. She hung up and waited for 2:17 a.m., when she knew from the nursing schedule that the resident on call would be in the break room grabbing coffee, when the attending physicians would be asleep in the on-call room on the 4th floor, when Marcus's grandmother would be dozing in the recliner beside her grandson's bed. She waited in her apartment and watched the rain and held the combat boots in her lap like a prayer that had never made it to God. Her phone rang at 2:19 a.m. Her phone rang at 2:19 a.m. The caller ID read Mercy General, and Elena was moving before she finished hearing the first word. She knew that tone, the voice of a night shift supervisor, tight and precise. We need you to come in. Marcus Brennan is having respiratory distress. Elena grabbed the combat boots from her nightstand, muscle memory pulling her toward the door before her conscious mind caught up. She didn't ask questions. She knew better than to ask questions when a child's oxygen saturation was dropping. The drive to Mercy General took 17 minutes. The streets of Houston were empty at this hour, nothing but traffic lights turning from green to red to green again, talking to themselves in the dark. Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the same position she'd held a rifle through the mountains of Tikrit. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still gleamed like it was wet with something worse than water. She pulled into the parking garage at 2:36 a.m., and her feet hit the tile corridor at a controlled pace that looked like a walk but felt like a sprint. The ICU was humming with the quiet intensity of machines keeping people alive. Elena clocked the monitors as she passed, reading vital signs like a language she'd learned before she could read English. 12 years of military trauma surgery had taught her that you could walk through a hospital like you owned it, certain, purposeful, and nobody would question whether you belonged. Her badge got her through the double doors without a pause. Marcus Brennan's room was at the end of the north corridor. Elena could hear his breathing from 20 feet away, shallow, rapid, the sound of air passing through narrowed space. His grandmother sat in the chair beside his bed, eyes wide, phone clutched in her trembling hand. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 87% and dropping. His lips were taking on a dusky hue, that particular shade of blue that meant his blood wasn't carrying oxygen anymore. The ventilator was running, but something was wrong. Something was mechanically, fundamentally wrong, and Dr. Sterling had missed it. Elena's mind moved through the differential diagnosis in the space between one breath and the next. Pneumothorax, no, the lungs sounded equal. Pulmonary embolism, possible, but his heart rate would be more elevated. Then she saw it, the way Marcus's neck veins were distended, tight and engorged even while lying flat. The way his pulse pressure had narrowed. The way his breathing had the desperate quality of a body trying to fill lungs that couldn't expand. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was accumulating around his heart, crushing it, preventing the chambers from filling. Sterling's rushed exams, his focus on maximizing patient turnover instead of actual patient care, had missed the most critical diagnosis, a diagnosis that required imaging Sterling had ordered but never bothered to read. She had 90 seconds. Maybe less. Elena moved to the monitor and verified what she already knew, oxygen saturation dropping to 84% now. Heart rate 142 and climbing. Blood pressure 68/42. The numbers were screaming what Sterling's incompetence had hidden. This child was in profound shock, and if she didn't decompress the fluid crushing his heart right now, Marcus Brennan would arrest before the sunrise he'd never see. Elena's hands were already moving. She grabbed the procedure cart from the corner, the emergency supplies cart that held exactly what she needed. Her fingers found the sterile packet containing an 18-gauge spinal needle, 3.5 inches long, the same needle she'd used in a field hospital outside Fallujah when a 7-year-old girl had taken shrapnel to the chest and no surgeon was available. The same procedure she performed in a Baghdad hospital basement by candlelight when the electricity went out and a young Iraqi boy's heart was being strangled by blood that shouldn't have been there. Marcus's grandmother woke fully now, awareness flooding her face. "What are you doing?" Elena didn't answer. There wasn't time for answers. She swabbed the area below the xiphoid process with betadine. The iodine smelled sharp and clinical, familiar as her own name. The skin turned orange-brown under the applicator. Her left hand found the anatomical landmarks, the angle of Louis, the fifth intercostal space, the exact point where the needle needed to go. Her right hand held the syringe with the needle attached, steady as a surgical laser. "Stop!" Marcus's grandmother was rising from her chair. "Stop, you can't." Elena advanced the needle at a 45-degree angle, feeling for the pop of the pericardial membrane, the distinct sensation of breaking through tissue planes. 20 years had passed since she'd done this in anything but a simulation. 20 years in the civilian world where people went to medical school and got credentials and didn't do emergency procedures in ICU rooms at 2:43 in the morning. But muscle memory lived deeper than credentials. It lived in the small muscles between her fingers, in the pressure sensors in her hand, in the part of her brain that had learned to sort life from death in the space of a heartbeat. She felt the pop. The sensation was unmistakable, even after 20 years. The blood came back dark, venous, heavy with the weight of what it had been doing, suffocating the organ beneath it. 60 milliliters. Her eyes watched the gradients on the syringe, 10 cubic centimeters, 20 cubic centimeters, 40 cubic centimeters, 60 cubic centimeters. Each milliliter was a piece of the child's life returning. The syringe filled with the dark blood, and simultaneously, something shifted in the monitor. The heart rate dropped from 142 to 119. The blood pressure jumped from 68/42 to 87/56. The oxygen saturation climbed, 84 to 87 to 91 to 95. Marcus gasped. His whole body shuddered, and he gasped like someone who'd been held underwater and suddenly remembered how to breathe. Elena withdrew the needle and pressed a 4x for gauze to the puncture site, maintaining pressure with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The monitor continued climbing. Oxygen saturation 97%. Heart rate 108. Blood pressure 92/58. Normal vital signs for a healthy 8-year-old child whose heart was no longer being crushed by blood that shouldn't have been there. Marcus's grandmother screamed. Not the scream of someone afraid, the scream of someone watching their worst fear turn into someone else's salvation. She reached for Elena, hand shaking, tears streaming. Elena didn't move away. She stood at the bedside and held the gauze in place until the bleeding stopped, her hand steady as concrete. The code team arrived 2 minutes later, rushing in with the equipment and authority of people trained to respond to emergencies. They stopped when they saw Elena standing there with a syringe full of blood, Marcus's vital signs stable and climbing, the crisis resolved. The team leader, a resident named Chen who'd been at Mercy General for 3 months, looked at the syringe, then at the monitors, then at Elena. "What happened?" "Cardiac tamponade," Elena said. Her voice was flat, clinical, the voice of a senior military medical officer reporting facts. 60 milliliters of blood in the pericardial sac. He was arrested within minutes. I performed emergency decompression at 2:43 a.m. One of the nurses, a woman named Garrett who'd worked in the ICU for 6 years, looked at the syringe with recognition. "Pericardiocentesis." Elena nodded. She set the syringe on the procedure tray with the care you'd use handling something sacred. The dark blood caught the fluorescent light and gleamed like an accusation. Dr. Sterling arrived 6 minutes later, still in street clothes, his face flushed from the drive or from rage or from the phone call that had pulled him from sleep. He took in the scene in a single glance, Elena at the bedside, the procedure tray with the syringe, Marcus's normalized vitals glowing on the monitor, the grandmother holding her grandson's hand with both of hers. Sterling's face shifted through emotions too fast to track, surprise, anger, something that looked like calculation. He stared at the blood-filled syringe for 3 full seconds. Then his eyes moved to Elena, and his voice came out cold as a blade. "Who authorized this procedure?" Elena met his eyes without flinching. "The patient's condition authorized it. He was dying." Sterling turned to the residents clustering in the doorway. "She performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight, without imaging confirmation, without consent. This is grounds for immediate termination and board investigation." His hand was already moving to his phone, fingers finding a number he'd had ready, a network he'd built for exactly this moment. He stepped into the hallway, and Elena heard him speaking rapidly to someone she couldn't identify. Words like scope of practice and patient endangerment and state board moving down the corridor like a predator claiming territory. The team leader, Chen, was looking at the monitors, then at Marcus, then back at Elena. That was... He didn't finish. He didn't have the clearance to finish. Elena removed the bloody gauze from Marcus's chest and replaced it with a sterile dressing, her movements precise and practiced. The grandmother was watching her with an expression that looked like the beginning of understanding something larger than a single moment. Marcus's eyes had closed, the crisis passed, his body finally relaxed enough to permit sleep. Within 20 minutes, Sterling had activated his full network. The hospital's risk management director arrived, tight-lipped and professional. Then came the state nursing board representative, a woman with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd done this before. They stood in the hallway outside Marcus's room, and Elena could see Sterling pointing at her through the window, his hands gesturing with the certainty of a man who'd already won. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that while they were moving through the bureaucracy of her destruction, while Sterling was activating the mechanisms that would remove her from the hospital and from Marcus Brennan's life, Elena knew something none of them knew. She knew that Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the version of her that had learned to read anatomy by feel, that had performed emergency surgery in the dark, that had pulled a 3-year-old boy from a collapsed building in Tikrit and held him until the medevac arrived, that version of her had just saved Marcus Brennan's life in a way that no amount of process or procedure or civilian credentialing could diminish. She also knew that Dr. Sterling was about to discover exactly how expensive it became to try to destroy the person who'd just become the only thing standing between the son of a Navy SEAL and a cold body bag. The conference room at Mercy General smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee that had been sitting in a pot since 6 in the morning. Elena sat across a mahogany table from 5 people who'd already made their decision before she walked in. Dr. Sterling occupied the far end, his posture relaxed, his fingers steepled like a man holding all the cards. Beside him sat Janet Reeves from Risk Management, her pen poised over a legal pad. The chief nursing officer, Margaret Hayes, wouldn't meet Elena's eyes. 2 board members, names Elena recognized from her documentation of the inflated billing claims, shifted in their chairs with the discomfort of men who knew exactly what was happening and had decided to let it happen anyway. Sterling opened the file in front of him with theatrical precision. Red ink marked nearly every page. His voice was measured, clinical, the voice of a man explaining a surgical complication to a family member. 3 weeks, Ms. Martinez. 3 weeks at Mercy General, and you believe you have the authority to perform invasive cardiac procedures without physician oversight or protocol approval. Elena said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the most powerful weapon in a room full of talking men. You performed emergency pericardiocentesis on a pediatric patient, he continued, sliding a photograph across the table, the needle in Marcus Brennan's chest, her hand steady, her focus absolute. Outside your scope of practice. Without consulting attending physician. Without waiting for cardiothoracic to arrive. Without, he paused, letting the silence do its work. Without any authorization whatsoever. Janet Reeves cleared her throat. Ms. Martinez, the hospital's liability exposure in this situation is significant. We need to understand your clinical reasoning. Elena met her eyes. The boy's pericardial sac was filling with fluid at a rate that would cause cardiac arrest within minutes. I had 2 choices, wait for the cardiologist to arrive, or perform the emergency intervention that saved his life. I chose to save his life. You chose to violate protocol, Sterling said quietly. His voice was like a knife being sharpened, danger in the gentleness of it. One of the board members, a man named Hartwell whose private practice billed Tikrit for $15,000 in unnecessary imaging studies per month, leaned forward. "What's your background, exactly?" "Your file shows some gaps in employment history." Elena had prepared for this. "Travel nursing. Rural clinics. I moved frequently. Travel nursing." Sterling repeated the words as if they were a diagnosis. "Yet your references are limited. Very limited. We attempted to verify your employment with 2 previous facilities. The supervisors we contacted," he opened a separate folder, his eyes gleaming. "They were difficult to reach. And when we did reach them, their accounts of your work history contained inconsistencies." The room's air pressure changed. Elena felt it like a hand closing around her throat. One supervisor stated you worked in a rural ICU in Nevada. Another said you worked primarily in emergency medicine in Colorado. A third position in your file, a trauma center in San Diego, has no record of ever employing anyone matching your description. Elena's hands remained still on the table. She didn't look away. Sterling smiled. "You've been lying about your credentials, haven't you?" "My clinical qualifications are legitimate," Elena said evenly. "The patient is alive because of my intervention." "The patient is alive," Sterling agreed, "despite your recklessness. Not because of it. Cardiothoracic arrived 14 minutes after you performed your procedure. Dr. Okafor reviewed your technique and noted it as adequate but unnecessarily aggressive. She specifically stated that a more conservative approach would have been preferable." It was a lie wrapped in a partial truth. Adequate but unnecessarily aggressive meant Elena had done it right. Dr. Okafor had actually patted her shoulder in the hallway and said, "Fast hands. That kid's lucky." But this room didn't need that truth. This room had already chosen its narrative. Margaret Hayes finally spoke. "We've also received complaints from multiple staff members regarding your conduct. Aggressive behavior, insubordination, and what several nurses described as an inappropriate involvement in patient care decisions above your pay grade." Elena had been at Mercy General for 3 weeks. She'd spoken to exactly 8 other nurses, all of whom she'd helped during shifts, all of whom had seemed grateful. Sterling must have been calling them within hours of her termination order, leveraging whatever institutional pressure he could manufacture. "I'd like to respond to the specific complaints," Elena said. "That won't be necessary," Janet Reeves said quietly. She slid a document across the table. "The hospital's legal team has reviewed the incident and determined that your actions constitute grounds for immediate termination. However, we're prepared to offer a settlement that protects both parties from further legal action. Sign this document, agree to the terms of separation, and we'll provide a neutral reference for future employment. Decline, and we'll file a report with the Texas Board of Nursing recommending a full investigation into your credentials and clinical practices." Elena read the document. The number was significant enough to cover 3 months of expenses. The non-disparagement clause ran to 6 paragraphs. The entire agreement was constructed to make her disappear as completely as possible from Mercy General's institutional memory. She didn't sign it immediately. "There's also the matter of the billing investigation," Sterling said conversationally. "It appears some of our diagnostic procedures for pediatric cardiac patients have been flagged by Tikrit for potential coding irregularities. That's a separate issue from your employment, of course, but the timing is unfortunate. They'll need to interview all relevant medical personnel, including you, should you choose to remain adversarial." It was a threat delivered with surgical precision. If Elena refused the settlement and reported the fraud, Sterling would use his board connections, the same men sitting in this room, to ensure she was the one investigated, not him. He had 5 people in the room who benefited from the billing scheme. She had 0. Elena signed the document. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice remained level. She pushed the papers back across the table and stood. "When do I need to collect my belongings?" she asked. "Security will escort you now," Margaret Hayes said. "We've already arranged for your locker to be emptied. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address." The security guard who walked her to the locker was a young man named David with kind eyes and the build of someone who'd spent time in a gym but had never used that strength on anyone who didn't deserve it. He said nothing as Elena cleared out the narrow metal locker that had been hers for 3 weeks. A photo of Sophia at age 8, before Elena had fully understood what it meant to lie to your child every single day. A stethoscope she'd purchased with her own money. And the combat boots, wrapped in a towel at the bottom, the leather cracked and salt-stained from Tikrit humidity, the laces still containing grains of sand from a city that no longer existed in any official military record. Elena held them carefully, as if they might disintegrate. "I don't know what happened," David said quietly, "but I saw you save that kid's life. Whatever they're saying, whatever they've decided, I saw you do something incredible in there. I wanted you to know that." Elena nodded once. She couldn't trust her voice. The parking lot was bright and brutal in the afternoon sun. The Texas heat pressed down like a physical thing, turning the asphalt soft. Elena placed the box David had given her on the passenger seat of her 11-year-old Honda Civic and sat motionless for 3 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes forward. Then she drove home at 2:22 p.m. on a Tuesday, still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and hospital air. Sophia was already home from school. Elena's daughter was in 7th grade at Bellaria Middle, old enough now to have her own key, old enough to understand when something was profoundly wrong. She sat at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, in their small rented house off Memorial Drive, and watched her mother set down the canvas bag containing the combat boots. Sophia's backpack lay discarded on the floor. Her homework remained unstarted. She'd been waiting for something without knowing what. "Mommy, why are you home?" Sophia asked. Her voice was small. "Did something bad happen?" Elena stared at the boots. The canvas bag hung open, revealing the scarred leather, the memories wrapped inside like shrapnel. 20 years. She'd worn those boots through 3 tours. She'd walked through rubble in those boots. She'd carried a 3-year-old boy, Jake Brennan, before he understood his own name, before he became a Navy SEAL, before his son was born deaf and sick and almost dead, in those boots, and the Pentagon had ordered her to destroy them along with every photograph, every medal, every record of the woman who'd worn them. Her name had been erased so thoroughly that even she sometimes wondered if Elena Martinez was the real identity and Senior Chief Petty Officer was the lie. The tears came without warning, without permission. Elena hadn't cried since 2004, and now they streamed down her face in the kitchen of her rental house while her 12-year-old daughter watched and learned that even warriors could break. Sophia moved around the table and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. Neither of them spoke. The fluorescent light above the kitchen sink buzzed with a sound like distant electricity, like the beginning of something. 3 days. That's how long it took for Jake Brennan to get stateside from the airfield in Al-Assad where his unit had been running convoy escort missions. 72 hours of commercial flights and military transport, of paperwork and handoff briefings, of sitting in uncomfortable seats while his 8-year-old son lay in a pediatric ICU bed with wires attached to his chest and a permanent pacemaker under his collarbone keeping his heart from collapsing in on itself again. The boy had been deaf since birth, a genetic thing, nothing that could be fixed, but his hearing aids were the only thing Jake had ever felt helpless against, because no amount of tactical training or combat experience prepared you for watching your son come into the world already broken in a way the military couldn't heal. 3 days, and now Jake Brennan stood in the lobby of Mercy General in Houston at 8:11 a.m., still wearing his dress uniform because he'd come straight from the airport, still carrying the smell of recycled airplane air and desert dust on his skin. The marble floor gleamed under fluorescent panels that buzzed like insects trapped in a light fixture. His eye scanned the crowd of staff members moving through the entrance, past the gift shop, toward the elevators. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, just needed to go back upstairs, back to his son's room, when a figure moved through the glass doors. A woman. Dark hair pulled back. Scrubs that didn't quite fit right, loose in the shoulders. And in her arms, worn at the heels and caked with something that looked like dried blood, a pair of combat boots. Jake stopped. His lungs locked. Time didn't slow down, that was Hollywood nonsense, but something in his chest recognized something in those boots before his conscious mind could catch up. He stared. Long enough that the woman noticed. Long enough that she turned, and when their eyes met, Jake saw something flicker across her face like a light switch being hit. Recognition. Or confirmation. Or memory. He whispered one word into the marble silence of that lobby. Ghost. The woman's jaw tightened. She didn't deny it. Didn't explain it. Didn't say anything at all, and that silence was louder than any speech could have been. Marcus Brennan's nurse, a young man named David Rodriguez who'd been monitoring Jake's son through the night shift, had come downstairs for coffee when he saw the SEAL in dress blues standing motionless in the lobby. Something about the way Jake was looking at the woman with the boots made David step closer, made him check his phone for the patient roster upstairs. Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez. The name appeared nowhere in official hospital records. No licensing database. No credentials file. But the incident report filed against her by Dr. Sterling, the one that had triggered her termination 48 hours ago, had referenced as Senior Chief Pierre Martinez as the person who performed an unauthorized emergency procedure. David's hand started to shake. He pulled up the Navy's public database on his phone, typed in the name Martinez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Tikrit. And there it was. A photograph. A unit citation. A name that had been classified until 6 months ago, erased from every official record for 20 years, and then suddenly declassified when new administrations changed policies about what could be hidden. The woman standing in the lobby was holding combat boots. She was looking at a Navy SEAL. And she was the person whose name appeared next to a notation that read, "Friendly fire incident, witnessed by attending corpsman, sworn to secrecy under National Security Directive 847-B, reinstated to service record 18 months prior." A Navy SEAL Captain, Garrett Cross, commanding officer of Jake's unit, had been in the hospital at 6:44 a.m. for Marcus Brennan's follow-up assessment when the lobby scene unfolded below. Hospital security had called up to pediatrics to report an unusual gathering. Cross descended the stairs and saw what was happening before anyone could explain it. He saw Jake Brennan frozen in place. He saw the woman with the boots. He saw David Rodriguez holding his phone with something like religious awe on his face. And Captain Cross understood immediately. He pulled out his own phone, made one call to the Pentagon liaison in Houston, and then he walked down those stairs and did something that would later be captured by news cameras and shared across military forums for years. He stood beside Elena Martinez and read her declarations aloud. His voice carried through the marble lobby like a command being issued to the entire building. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Staff members stopped walking. The coffee counter fell silent. Purple Heart. Another pause. Longer this time. A woman at the information desk started to cry without knowing why. Second Purple Heart. Cross's voice didn't waver. And Navy Cross for actions in Tikrit in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He stopped. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when the atmosphere itself is holding its breath. Senior Chief Martinez saved my commanding officer's life in 2004. She saved his son's life again 2 days ago in pediatric ICU room for 12. Same patient. 20 years apart. Same woman. Same boots. Cross nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of formal recognition. This hospital failed her. I did not. An FBI liaison named Agent Samuel Chen, no relation to the hospital administrator, though they would soon be having a very productive conversation, stepped forward with documentation that had been in motion since Elena's termination triggered automatic alerts within the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Chen's voice was careful, precise, the way federal agents learn to speak in rooms full of witnesses. He explained that Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had been erased from official records in 2004 after witnessing a friendly fire incident involving the son of a sitting congressman. The order had come down from the Defense Intelligence Agency itself. Her service record, her commendations, her deployment history, all of it redacted, classified, locked behind barriers that wouldn't be opened until the congressman died in office and new legal precedents made the cover-up untenable. In 2023, her name had been reinstated to the system. Her medals had been authorized for display. Her service had been formally recognized as valid and authentic. But Mercy General's Human Resources Department had no way of knowing this when they processed her initial employment paperwork. They'd seen a nurse with credentials from a community college and a 5-year gap in her work history that she'd never explained. They'd hired her anyway, because staff shortages in pediatrics meant asking too many questions could cost you candidates. She was legally entitled to remain anonymous, Chen said, his eyes moving to Sterling's empty office on the second-floor window. She chose to save that child anyway. Administrator Marcus Chen, a former Marine Corps logistics officer whose father had served in Vietnam and whose brother still worked for Naval Supply Systems Command in San Diego, had been the one to make the call that would define his entire legacy at Mercy General. He emerged from his corner office at 9:17 a.m., already in motion. He'd been briefed by Elena's daughter Sophia, who had called the hospital at 6:44 a.m. to report insurance fraud, who'd explained in careful detail how her mother had documented every overbilled procedure, every unnecessary test, every inflated claim. Sophia had the notebooks. Sophia had copies sent to her secure email. Sophia had been saving her mother's evidence for 6 months without telling anyone, and when her mother came home at 2:24 p.m. on a Tuesday with severance papers and broken composure, Sophia had made a choice: protect her mother by staying silent, or protect her mother by breaking the silence. She'd chosen correctly. Marcus Chen walked into the pediatric floor at 9:31 a.m. with a federal marshal at his side. He found Dr. Sterling in his office, still unaware that anything unusual had transpired in the lobby, still confident that the troublesome nurse had been eliminated and the billing scheme would continue undetected. Sterling looked up from his desk and saw the administrator's face, a particular expression that only people who've seen combat can fully understand, the look of someone about to execute a decision they've already made. Dr. Benjamin Sterling, Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Your privileges at Mercy General are revoked effective immediately. You are hereby terminated for cause, insurance fraud, falsification of medical records, and retaliatory action against a protected whistleblower. Sterling's face cycled through colors, shock to anger to something approaching hysteria. Based on what evidence? One patient? One procedure? Chen turned to the marshal, who stepped forward and cut Sterling's hospital ID from around his neck. The security camera captured it perfectly. The local news crew that had been tipped by an unknown source, probably Agent Chen himself, filmed it through the glass doors. By 10:13 a.m., the story was in circulation through hospital staff channels. By 2:48 p.m., it was on local news. By 6:02 p.m., it was being discussed on medical ethics forums. By the next morning, it was national. Dr. Benjamin Sterling, caught mid-crime, expelled from his institution, his career imploding like a star collapsing inward. 6 months later, Elena pushed open the glass doors of the newly constructed Patient Advocacy Office at Mercy General, the position having been created specifically because of what had happened, specifically to ensure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. Her nameplate sat beside the door in brass letters, Elena Martinez, Director of Patient Rights and Military Liaison. The office was small but hers, a desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets full of cases she was already reviewing, staff members already calling on her to mediate disputes, to investigate suspicious billing, to stand between patients and institutional power. And on the wall behind her desk, in a shadow box with UV protective glass, sat the combat boots. Beside them hung her Navy Cross citation, framed and official and no longer classified. Below the boots, a brass plaque read, "Service Beyond Self, honoring those who sacrifice visibility to save lives." Marcus Brennan, 8 years old and deaf and alive, visited the office twice a month for appointments, and he'd learned to sign "Thank you, Ghost" in ASL, his phrase for Elena, the woman who appeared like a phantom and saved his life. His father, Jake Brennan, had extended his deployment by 6 months to stay near Houston while Marcus recovered. They visited together, bringing drawings the boy had made in occupational therapy. Sophia, Elena's daughter, had started volunteering at Mercy General, and she now worked in the office alongside her mother, answering phones and helping file complaints. On a Saturday afternoon in month 6, Elena drove Sophia to a grocery store in a strip mall on the southeast edge of Houston. Through the windshield, she spotted a folding table under a faded umbrella. A man sat behind it in a wrinkled polo shirt, his face weathered and his eyes gone dull. Dr. Sterling was selling cut-rate health insurance policies to people who moved past him without stopping. Elena didn't slow. Didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge him, though she saw him recognize her, saw his shoulders cave inward like the bones had given up. Through her rearview mirror, she caught sight of Mercy General's glass entrance in the distance, her nameplate gleaming in the afternoon sun. That evening, after Sophia had finished her shift and returned home, Elena stood at the window of her office, looking down at the pediatric ward where night shift nurses moved between rooms with quiet competence. The boots sat in their shadow box. The medals hung framed and permanent. And Elena thought about the question that had haunted her for 20 years, whether staying hidden was the same as staying safe, whether disappearing was the same as surviving. She thought about Sophia, about the patients she could help here, about the civilians who needed someone to fight for them the way she'd fought for Marines in the dark. Captain Cross called that evening, offering her a position training Navy corpsman in advanced field trauma procedures, a role that would take her to bases across the country. Elena listened to every word. She considered it seriously. She stood in her office looking at those boots and imagined hanging them on a wall in San Diego instead of Houston. And then she told Cross that she was staying. Not out of fear. Not out of obligation. But because she understood something now that she hadn't understood before, the quietest battles are fought in hospital corridors, not on battlefields. The ones that matter most are the ones nobody witnesses. She told Cross what her first platoon sergeant had told her in boot camp, back when she was just learning what it meant to carry responsibility. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Cross understood. He did what officers do when they encounter people who've already made the harder choice. He saluted her, both hands occupied with his phone as he held it to his ear, but the gesture unmistakable. Elena stayed at Mercy General. The boots remained in the shadow box. The work continued. And somewhere in a strip mall parking lot, a man who'd believed he could break the rules without consequence was learning that some debts demand payment in currencies no insurance company will accept. If you've made it this far, you already know what it means to question what you see. You already understand that the most dangerous people aren't the ones making noise, they're the ones moving quietly through spaces, carrying competence in their hands and terrible knowledge in their eyes. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who refuse to disappear, no matter what system demands it. Like this video if you'd have made the same choice Elena did. Comment below, would you have stayed, or taken the offer from the Pentagon? And share this with someone who needs to remember what real courage looks like.